Well, we'll make a start now at our second webinar in this series of workshop reports from the Thredbo 17 conference, which was held in Sydney last September. My name is John Nelson. I'm the chair in public transport at ITLS, and I am your host for this webinar. Just a few housekeeping announcements before we get started. So for webinar participants, there is no voice or camera. You do, however, have access to the Q&A box, and we'd be grateful if you would use that to post your questions. At the end of each of the presentations, there will be a Q&A session in which our speakers will address the questions that have been posted. There's also going to be a recording of this webinar, and this will be available post-event, as will any slides that the presenters are happy to make available. The format for this webinar is that there will be 3 presentations of up to 20 minutes, covering the 3 workshops that have formed part of the agenda for today's webinar. And following each presentation, there will be a short Q&A session, and we have allocated up to 15 minutes for that. At this point, we're going to go into our first presentation, which covers workshop 3 from the Thredbo 17 conference, and you'll hear the topic in a moment or two. We have 2 speakers. The first speaker is Lisa Hansen. Lisa is a full professor of urban and regional planning at Molde University College. She's held research positions at Linköping University and at VTI, the Swedish National Road and Transport Research Institute. She's also worked with regional development at the Government of Sweden, Ministry of Enterprise and Innovation. Lisa Hansen is a transport governance researcher focusing on the land passenger transport sector. Her research spans a wide range of topics, from studies on contentious measures and car use, plan integration, to competitive tendering of public transport. And Lisa is sharing this presentation with Wai-An Leong. Wai-An is Chief Transport Economist at Singapore's Land Transport Authority. In this role, he leads a small team of economists and other social scientists in understanding travel behaviour, attitudes and preferences. Beyond the conventional benefits of transport appraisal, the team is more recently focused on issues of transport fairness and the extent to which the distribution of transport resources in the community can be said to be equitable. Wai-An is an active member of the Thredbo community, having successfully co-chaired local organising committee of Thredbo 16 in 2019, making it the first time that the Thredbo conference has been hosted in an Asian country. So without any further ado, I will invite Lisa to make her presentation.
Thank you, John. Can you hear me?
I can.
Yes, perfect. So I will just start sharing my slide. Do you see the slides?
Yep, that's clear.
Perfect. Okay. So hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good day. So we will talk about the workshop we had on infrastructure, services and urban development. So I will start and then Wai-An will take over. So this workshop had actually quite a broad call for paper, and we draw on discussions from several former threads we have had on the Thredbo conference. We draw on papers from the previous conferences on social exclusion and user groups. We draw on papers related to wider benefits and the use of efficient resources. And we also had papers drawing on threads from large infrastructure projects, BRT, etc. So it is a bit of a broad perspective, but I think we got a very good and focused discussion within this workshop. We include all mobility services in this workshop, so we don't focus on one mode. We also emphasize integration of policy and service delivery. Drawing from the papers from the large infrastructure projects, we also had quite a good discussion on implementation challenges and tools to achieve this, to overcome this. The workshop has an integrated view on sustainability, drawing on the triple bottom line of sustainability. There has been, by tradition, an emphasis on economic goals, but we address that we need to also consider social and environmental aspects within transport and land use planning. We also discussed a lot the need of recognizing value of transport and distribution of resources. Okay, so we actually had 15 papers from participants across the world: Australia, Norway, Japan, UK, South Africa, Sweden, Korea, Malta, the Netherlands, France. And I will not go over the papers, but in general, we had most papers focused on the single case studies or comparative case studies. And we have drawn findings based on different contexts. And I think we managed to do some general conclusions, even though they are situated in mainly case study contexts. Okay, let's see if we can change slide. Okay, so in the light of the Thredbo tradition, we had set up a few research questions in the beginning, but that was revised during the workshop, and we ended up with one overall research question. What are the key factors for strategic planning, implementation, and service provision in the post-pandemic area? And we concluded that we would like to emphasize 3 central factors: good outcomes for all in a post-pandemic future, value of transport service improvement, and good implementation processes and outcomes through inclusive design. And I will give a short overview of the first factor, and then I will pass on the word. Okay. So we have this factor or heading called good outcomes for all in a post-pandemic future. It might sound a bit fussy, but it is a very important aspect. It draws on the tradition from previous Thredbo conferences, where we have worked with identifying and raising awareness of the importance of fair, affordable, and inclusive transport services. So we continue with that work, but we have also papers that show new aspects of this. We believe the emphasis on good outcome for all, that includes both existing and future generations. So it is central that we also think about the effects, the long-term effects, when we talk about especially strategic transport and land use planning. As I said in the beginning, there has been, by tradition, emphasis on the economic goals within sustainability, but we see a strong need to also address the social and environmental considerations especially on the strategic planning level. There are cities that work with that now, London, Vancouver, etc. And we have papers addressing that. We also need that and in this lies, for example, studies of the 15 minutes society or 20-minute city. We emphasize on the integration of transport and land use, and that means that there is an uneven distribution of resources in a city or in an urban setting, and there need to be, we need to ensure physical structures and also physical infrastructure, but also physical structures that makes a good social community, and that is linked to the land use planning. And this must be seen in combination with transport planning and assurance of transport service provision and so on. So we focus on what we call equity in transport planning. It comes from the paper by John Stanley. And within this, how do we achieve this? We have several papers that shows the importance of community level, that we need to have a focus on community level and not just the urban or city level. And within this, work with participatory planning processes in order to include the varied group of people being in a community or in an area. We also continue the work. We believe it's important to continue the work on inclusion of user and non-user groups that might be in the risk of high risk of social exclusion. And within this, I would like to put forward one paper that highlighted a group that we believe have been very much ignored in both the research and in the policy work so far, and that is people that suffers from mental health problems or cognitive disabilities that are not physical or visible. This paper showed that both the work with universal design has not met that type of group, and we can also see it in policy discussions and so on. So we believe there is still quite a lot of work to be done within what we call hidden groups hidden groups within the transport system. Since we emphasize both on the strategic planning, integration of transport and land use, and the bottom-up level or the community level, we see that these processes must converge. In understanding good outcomes for all lies also the recognition of understanding the benefits of transport services for all, and we had a quite good discussion on the importance of threshold services that are inclusive for all. I think that leads into our next point, which I will leave the word to Wayang.
Great, thanks very much, Lisa. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay, thanks very much, Lisa. Okay, if you don't mind, I'll just ask you to leave the slides on your share screen, and then I'll cue the advance when it's time to do that. Thank you.
Perfect.
Okay, thanks. Right. So as Lisa mentioned, one other focus in workshop 3 was on understanding the value of improving transport services, and also understanding the costs and the benefits of these services. So a few of the papers that were presented and discussed at the workshop showed that efficiency gains can be realized without major expensive new adjustments, and that small improvements in the transport system could be especially valuable for some groups. So for example, we talked about how rescheduling school starts in Sweden, or how a small increase in fares in Oslo, Norway, could lead to large improvements in the transport system and efficiencies. So during the discussions, many participants in our workshop stressed the importance of recognizing that additional service has different value to different groups, and that mobility and transport options make it possible for people to make choices that increase their quality of life. So for example, a new bus line in a particularly underserved area could improve life satisfaction and quality of life quite dramatically. Our workshop participants highlighted that it is important to be aware of what drives costs of service provision and how they are distributed over the transport system in the city or in the region. So we call for a more inclusive definition of wider benefits, arguing that improvements to public sector productivity, that was in one of our papers, are often neglected when we discuss wider benefits. Most of the time, we only focus on benefits to the private sector, but we do need to think a bit about how the public sector can benefit as well from transport improvements. The papers also highlighted the value of sustainable urban change and the efficient land use. Then this was very aptly highlighted from a use case in Melbourne, which attempted to jointly model land use, transport, and economic interactions. We discussed the unintended positive outcomes or consequences of COVID-19, such as working from home, and how this has impacted transport networks and the changing role of public transport. So overall, in this workshop, we emphasize the need to recognize the value of transport and the distribution of resources, both in terms of better using existing resources and working with methods that capture the value of transport improvements from the flexible integrated transport and then use perspective. Can you go next slide, please? Right. So one last theme from workshop 3 that I'd like to share in today's webinar relates to this idea of good implementation processes and outcomes through inclusive institution design. So through several case studies on the implementation of various transport projects, such as a Franco-Swiss cross-border rail, mobility hubs in Europe, and also rapid rail BRT systems in a developing country context, we learned about the challenges such as coordination difficulties, adjusting systems to local geography, and financing. So we want to call attention to the need to further develop objective decision-making tools that better assess outcomes of planned processes, including wider social perspectives such as factors relating to social values and uneven land use distribution. We also discussed the importance of recognizing public participation and participatory techniques in transport projects and the need for planners to further develop certain skills, including the skill of communication, the art of communication, and a willingness to use various participatory techniques in their planning paradigms. And so if you're really serious about achieving good implementation processes that are inclusive, we need to map preferences of the relevant stakeholders and recognize their role in this decision-making process. And finally, in line with the spirit of previous Thredbo discussions, we are calling for more systematic work on common understanding of what implementation is in transport settings, and to move from focusing on one transport mode to transport integration. So this includes understanding various stakeholders' strategies, which might be linked to the different environments where they're sited in, different modes of transport, different sectors, formal and informal, different types of institutions, their objectives of integration, their challenges, as well as their strategies. The next slide, please. So finally, to sum up the workshop report, so what are some of our recommendations for research and policy? So overall, in workshop 3, we are emphasizing, or we wish to emphasize, the need for more research on equity in transport settings, including the meaning of equity, meaning of transport equity, and how it is linked to threshold service levels and strategic land use planning. There's a need for more research on different user and non-user groups, including understanding the barriers for vulnerable groups. That's what Lisa alluded to when she talked a bit about people with mental health conditions. The workshop participants also encourage more research on developing frameworks for implementation linked to the transport context, including achieving inclusive participatory processes and developing modeling and evaluation tools. What an efficient land use system looks like post-pandemic, including working from home arrangements and possible spatial changes, could be topics for investigation under this broad umbrella of urban adaptation, and also how institutions and processes can be made more adaptable and more agile to change. In terms of some key takeaways for policymakers, we advocate for the adoption of frameworks of planning strategies that enable development of complete communities with active travel and public transport choices. So policymakers should also encourage integrated transport and land use plans instead of separate planning as sometimes happens. And because with separate planning comes that potential for unwanted distributional impacts. So policy makers could really consider optimizing existing transport solutions and resources before going for the new. When planning and implementing new systems, the focus should lie on desired outcomes on a community level with inclusive institutional design. Now, in light of the climate and energy crisis, public transport authorities and operators have a specific responsibility to thoroughly review their energy profile and emphasize fossil-free solutions. Policymakers should also dare to set more aggressive growth targets for active transport and public transport. But they need to carefully investigate how these targets are shaped and the effects that these targets might have on market development, as well as the possible risk of social exclusion for groups that are already vulnerable to these risks. Overall, the workshop emphasized the need for more research and policy action to create sustainable transport systems and cities that benefit all members of the community. And of course, we are very delighted that such conversations will carry on at Thredbo 18 in Cape Town. And we can move on next slide, which is a roundup of our workshop participants, and I think we have some time for questions and answers and discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lisa and Wayan, and thank you, Wayan, for making that reference to Thredbo 18 as well. I will mention that in the closing remarks, but as it's come up already, let me also mention it now, just so everyone is aware. Thredbo 18 is taking place in Cape Town in South Africa from Sunday the 29th of September to Thursday the 3rd of October 2024, and the call for abstracts is already open. Well, thank you for your both of you for your excellent timekeeping. We're going to move now into a period of Q&A, and as I mentioned at the beginning, and I saw that Becky also posted a reminder, we're using the Q&A chat function. So please, I would encourage you to ask questions by that channel. We have our first question already, but we'll be hoping for a few more as well. And John Preston asks, can you give examples of inclusive institutional design? Maybe Lisa, would you like to start on that one?
Yes, I can do that. Well, it is a broad question, and I think it can also be something that can be discussed more on the next Thredbo conference. But related to the inclusive institutional design is to find forms and processes where you also recognize, for example, groups on community level that can be part of the strategic planning. We had a paper on participatory processes from, I think it was from Japan, who showed how to, in a positive way, with a good example on how to engage the community level using a place-based plan approach. So it is, part of it is to also get, maybe talk about a bit more new forms of public participation. But it is also institutional design. It's also about the strategic level, you know, recognize groups and also think about effects, integrating the land use and transport planning in a sense, so it doesn't lead to unwanted distributional effects, for example. But it is a broad, we discussed it a lot, and how can we achieve good processes for this. We also emphasized, as Wei-Yang said, that we also have to think about evaluation and models, how to investigate effects and evaluate effects on the plans we have and the projects we have that take account maybe a wider perspective.
Thank you. Wei-Yang, do you want to?
Sure. Thanks. Thanks very much, Lisa, and thanks, John, for the question. I think it's it is really important question, and I think we were also quite struck, by some of the work from John Jen and Stanley about threshold service levels and actually what that means, what that implies for transport equity. And so I would assume that some sort of inclusive institutional design must also it must be closely linked with this idea of what transport equity is, what minimum or what threshold service levels are, and whether we can actually guarantee certain levels of service provision to all members of the community. We talked also about David Hensch's paper of working from home and the trends post pandemic, and certainly a part of that must also cater to some of the changing needs, changing travel patterns, changing aspirations of workers, and how we can actually include some of these newer modalities, preferences into our planning process. So I would also argue for that to be a part of an inclusive design, institutional design.
Thank you. We'll come to John Stanley's question in a moment, but I see he's also added what I think is more of a comment, which we should note now. Places like Vancouver are good at vertical institutional integration, aligning regional strategies and local plans with a good line of sight. So that does sound like a good example of best practice. But before we change tack, though, I have a question that I wanted to ask, which I think is related to the one that which we've just been discussing, which is a reference Lisa made to hidden groups, I think the phrase was. So it would be interesting to hear a little bit more about the hidden groups that you discussed, how their needs can be recognized and adequately and suitably incorporated into the inclusive design that you're advocating.
I think that was a paper that it opened up for a good discussion, but it was also a bit of a wake-up call. It was a paper from Norway where they had investigated groups suffering from, or varied groups suffering from various type of mental health problem, cognitive problems, and so on, non-visible physical hinders. And we just realized that, okay, this is a group we have not addressed much on the Thredbo conferences and not in research. We have focused quite a lot on a policy level, at least on universal design, but there is still a lot to do for this group. So this paper was quite, I mean, it was a paper based on a very small unit of interviews. So it's of course it is an explorative study in that case, but it shows that we have also work to do with yeah, there are groups that are definitely not included in the discussions on, for example, universal design. So I think that is also a policy recommendation that is very important. And now after this Thredbo conference, I usually actually ask, when I talk with transport planners and so on, how do you work with these groups with your inclusion of when you talk about universal design and so on? How we should identify these groups and so on. It is, of course, a challenge. It was clear in this paper, it was a challenge to get hold of these people. Some people have society anxiety, etc. But I think the need for more focus on a community level and processes, bottom-up processes, can be also a way to address also non-user groups or hidden groups.
Thank you. I think that is an important point. Question from John Stanley, and this is an excellent question, and I'm going to give notice to our other two workshop presenters that this is a question that I'm going to ask every workshop team to answer, but starting with workshop 3, who are currently in the spotlight. John Stanley asks, how can we get findings from Thredbo included in planning and evaluation guidelines?
I'll take a stab at that first.
That both of you may want to comment on that one, but Wayan,
okay.
No extra pressure. I mean, you're a past conference organizer as well.
Yes. Thanks very much, John, for the question. So, I think first of all, at the practical level, we need to keep on, we need to keep it as a formula of making sure that policymakers, practitioners attend Thredbo conferences. And we need to make sure that we always have that dialogue and interaction between the academics, researchers, and the policymakers, because I think that's really important. And so, just as a very practical example, John would know anyway, but we have been, corresponding with John since Thredbo 17 on some of his work about on threshold service levels, inclusivity, and we are actually very seriously doing some of the modeling that he has done in the Singapore context, and we are also advocating for some of those ideas that he advocated for in his papers about value of mobility, understanding how the value that people place on trip making, and understanding the social aspect of transport, how it might reduce the risk of social exclusion. So these are ideas that I picked up from Thredbo, and we are very actively doing research in this area. There is a lot of talk, or there's a lot of discussion in Singapore about the idea of aging in place. We are an aging society. 1 in 4 will be more than 60 or 65 in 7 years' time. We need people. The dementia is a serious concern, and that's why we talk about mental health conditions as well. People with dementia, they may not necessarily, you may not necessarily know they have dementia, but they may have issues or they may have trouble with wayfinding. And so all of these questions about how they can age in place, how we can design neighborhoods to support their lifestyle, to support their mobility needs, these are very, very real questions. And I'm very glad that our discussions at Thredbo have fed into some of these discussions back here in Singapore.
Thank you, Wai-An. Lisa, perhaps a Nordic perspective?
Yes, I think I agree. I think it's, I mean, one thing is to attend the Thredbo conferences, of course, but also webinars like this, spreading the word a bit more, is also important. But I think in a like from a research perspective, today we do research often very close together with practitioners, planners, etc. At least the projects I work with, and I think that is also important, that we have an integration and an applied perspective within the work we do as a researcher. We can also use the Thredbo conference, I think, to highlight good examples. We have some very good case studies, and spread the word on, okay, here we have some examples from cities that we maybe not normally look at, and also should show good examples and good cases. But in one way, Thredbo is context. I mean, it's context dependent when we talk about policies and so on, but I think we can learn quite a lot across the continents and across the contexts. But I think good example is also a very important thing that comes from the Thredbo conference. It is always difficult how to communicate and how to get some effects out of the research you do in practice. But I think you had very good examples, Wai-An.
Can I perhaps jump in there and add
Sure.
another perspective?
Yep.
Is it allowed, John? Thank you.
It's allowed. That doesn't mean that we might not do it again at the end of your talk, though, Rico.
Oh yeah, please. But the more interaction, the better, I guess. Because I think it's not just getting this into the guidelines, but getting it into action as well. And I think we have an excellent example with Juan Carlos Munoz, who is a long-term supporter of the Thredbo series. And I remember vividly having workshops with him, and he presenting, in a similar sort of vein of what we are doing now. And he has become the Minister of Transport and Telecommunications of Chile, and is implementing a lot of things that we have discussed at Thredbo conferences as we speak. So it's not just guidelines, but we have an example there where things are actually implemented in day-to-day transport policy. I just wanted to make that remark.
Perfect. So thank you for that, Rico. And we'll come back to this wider question after the next two presentations as well. And Kibo has put a comment in the Q&A endorsing the value of the type of webinar that we are currently running, and that's very helpful feedback. I would add also, just in case I haven't done the analysis, but if there are any first time Thredboites on the webinar today in the attendance, please do take away that this is a very unique conference series, that we have a very, very strong focus on bringing together practice, policy, and academia, and that really makes for a quite unique experience. So thank you, John Stanley, for prompting us to address this important point about the connection between the findings of what we present and discuss, and where relevant, the the imperative, I would say, to get these into planning and evaluation guidelines. Well, we're doing pretty well on time, so it's my task now to thank Lisa and Wayang once again for their presentation, and to move us on now to the workshop 4 presentation, which is going to be given by my ITLS colleague Rico Merkit. Just a word or two about Rico. Rico is chair in transport and supply chain management at ITLS, where he is also the deputy director of the institute. He has a PhD in transport economics and has taught and researched at a number of high-profile institutions, including Cranfield University, the Haas Business School, the University of California, Berkeley, and he also serves as a visiting professor at the University of Johannesburg. Rico is editor-in-chief of the Journal of Air Transport Management and associate editor of the Journal of Transport and Supply Chain Management, and a member of a number of TRB standing committees. Rico, I would invite you to share your screen at this point and to give us the report back from workshop 4.
Apologies. Difficulties getting this up. I don't know. My Zoom has updated, and I had it up for the teaching today. Let's share my entire screen.
I can probably help you out if that doesn't work, because
should be okay.
I've now
see, just one sec, please. Apologies. I would have loved to be able to test this, but I was, as you know, I was in a Senate inquiry, summoned to be a witness on decision to not extend the frequencies of Qatar into Australia and their service agreements. So, but I believe you should be able to see my screen now. Is that correct?
Yeah. Can you put it into presentation mode?
Yes.
And then we're
I will do that.
good to go. Okay. Thank you, Rico.
Fantastic. So thank you very much, John, for this kind introduction. And I should acknowledge that you were actually co-sharing this workshop with me. So any difficult questions shall be sent to you after that brief, I think, 15-minute sort of presentation. And on all seriousness, I think that it's the two of us who will respond to questions.
Sure.
And if you feel that I've missed something or want to chip in something, please do interrupt me at any point in time and try and make this a sort of a joint sort of thing, which it has been also during the conference. And so I very much enjoyed sharing this workshop with you. So we based this workshop on, as we usually do, on a number of previous workshops at previous Thredbo conferences, and one of those was on emerging ecosystems and business models. And we thought that, looking at emerging technology and particularly innovation in the space of sustainability would be really something that is of interest. And we have not been proven wrong. It was a fantastic workshop and really interesting. And the title of the workshop was Optimizing the Impact of Technological Innovation on achieving sustainable public transport outcomes. So we're really interested in trying to understand how this technology drives sustainable public transport outcomes today. And you see a couple of pictures here already. We had quite a large group, despite only having 7 papers in this session. And initially I thought, oh, only 7 papers, that's not very good. But in fact, it proved to be excellent. It was really good to have 7 papers there, because those papers we were able to group into 3 different perspectives. So we had one paper to start off with, because it was still very much around COVID and the whole working from home sort of theme to which ITL has contributed a lot of work. And so we had one paper that kicked us off in the context of working from home and what that may mean to sustainability and transport outcomes. And then we had 2 papers where we had essentially authorities, and here I mean particularly transport authorities, telling us what was currently happening in their field in terms of sustainability and transport. We then had also 2 papers presented from operators, and here primarily bus operators. And finally, we had 2 papers that were more concerned with the end users and so consumers, and that try to understand what's currently happening and how we can change behavior, A, and B, how can we better assess what end consumers actually think, and how can we improve survey design. So there was one paper in there that talked about gamification, so technology trying to sort of get the survey respondents more engaged, get them more involved, and therefore improve the outcomes of any surveys. So that was more on the consumer side of things. Again, we had the operators and also the authorities in there. 6 papers in those 3 groups, and then the working from home paper that kicked us off. What was really fantastic, and I think this is really something that becomes more prominent about Thredbo or the Thredbo conference series, is that we had so many participants in that workshop. So we had 19 participants who were there throughout the entire period of the conference and who contributed tirelessly to the discussions, which then resulted in us sort of exploring new themes around those 7 papers, but also around what we called a public transport contract experiment, where we really engaged in group work that was around putting operators and authorities at a table, having both sides supported by academics and consultants, and let them try to negotiate what a perfect transport could look like and what it would sort of incorporate in terms of the sustainability targets that we had identified through the presented papers, but also through the discussions that we had as a result of those papers. So we had lots of little workshops, workshop exercises, lots of activities, and lots of talking going on that really helped us to derive some interesting outcomes. But before we got there, we essentially sat down and tried to come up with a number of definitions, because we felt that this is all very fuzzy, and particularly the term sustainability, what does it actually mean? And we found that obviously you need to look at the commercial side of things, so commercial sustainability, commercial viability, but also the environmental side, and increasingly also the social side of things, which would not just include communities, but actually, interestingly enough, we had a couple of bus operators in there who felt that the workers and the bus drivers are part of that socialist sort of perspective as well, which I found personally really interesting. We then also talked about thresholds and priorities, because sustainability, again, it means a lot to different people, but when you start measuring it, it becomes even fuzzier. And then we also looked at what does technology mean in this context, and what is actually the toolbox that is available to both authorities, but then also the operators to make a difference in terms of sustainable outcomes. And I think that was really, really helpful and really interesting, because we started, and a lot of this workshop was really visual. In that context, I mean, I hear Kim saying that this webinar is fantastic because it gives you access to what you have done there, and you know, you can participate without even traveling to the conference. And I agree, this is great. This is a fantastic add-on. But what I really like about the Thredbo conference is that you come into a room with operators, with public transport authorities, so government officials, transport ministers, with consumers, with academics, consultants, and you all put them into one room and you discuss those topics and get all these different perspectives. And I, you know, even I as a professor learned so much during these days because we get the perspectives from all players. And particularly in this workshop, we visualized a lot of the things that we discussed. And so on my slide here, I have on the right-hand side, just to give you one example, a bus that one of the CEOs of a bus operator contributed throughout the session. And it shows quite nicely about what the toolbox might look like, or what the some sort of issues might be around sustainability in the electrification of buses, which is obviously a big topic here in Australia, but I think also globally. And so there's talk about, do we really need to have a fully electrified fleet, or is there an option of having some sort of hybrid sort of thing, which also allows for some hydrogen sort of buses in there, or perhaps a hybrid sort of alternative in the one bus. Which then sort of leaves questions as to, okay, how do you finance this? How do you perhaps modularize the capital cost around such a bus, where the chassis is something like 500,000 alone, but has a asset life of quite often more than 20 years, whereas the battery will only last you 6-7 years and costs obviously a lot less, but needs to be replaced more often. But to take this modular approach, we found would be quite useful, not only from an authority but also from an operator's perspective, because it would potentially allow different types of procurement and also would allow to entertain the idea of having certain procurement exercise but also maintenance perhaps more decentralized when this comes primarily down to the batteries. And so we discussed also operations and how to manage that in the context of an electrified bus fleet. So some of the emerging themes that we covered, obviously COVID-19 and working from home was a biggie, and what we felt, look, this is obviously that has had massive impact on patronage of public transport, but we thought, look, it's actually also good because we could take advantage of this, right? We could take advantage of this in the sense that we could rethink of how transport is organized, what innovation is out there, and how can we implement that innovation. But of course, then there was talk about, there's also a lot of uncertainty around the governance of public transport, or also the operation of public transport, and so that was seen as a bit of a challenge. And then again, we came back to how do you define sustainability, and particularly at a city level, how do you define whether a city is sustainable or not? And so perhaps we found there's a need for a global index, and that was an interesting outcome there. And then again, due to this modelization that I discussed in regard to this picture here, we also felt that there might be alternative approaches out there to asset ownership, which would allow the competition for public transport, particularly bus public transport operations, to be enhanced. And so perhaps there's a scope there for authorities to own a few of those electric or zero emission buses, and that would then take away one key entry barrier and would allow potentially for more competition for or in that bus operating market. We also talked a lot about collaboration and what the governance of such a collaboration should look like, and particularly how digitization could help in that context. We talked about the Philippines, but we talked about the Netherlands and all sorts of other jurisdictions as well. And of course, safety is one part of sustainability too, and that comes back to what I said in terms of the social aspect here, where we have workers also involved, and so it's not just the consumers that ask for safety, but it's also the bus drivers and anyone who is on the bus or in the depots who would fall under that as well. And then we also discussed, what this new technology could mean in terms of more flexible revenue management, which would have then an impact on sustainability, particularly from a commercial viability perspective. Because at the end of the day, we acknowledge, this, sustainability and all this is great, but at the end of the day, it's really very much around patronage still, and it's still the dominant force in the industry, and drives a lot of things, not just on the operator side, but also from the public transport authority side of things. And so having all these people in the room was really a fantastic experience again. And we really, it yielded really a fantastic brains trust, if you like, that then resulted in us finding all these interesting outcomes. And in terms of research, we thought that, and again, it was, still sort of around the pandemic, maybe it's less topical now, but back then, remind you, that was a year ago. We were really talking still a lot about what the pandemic means and what it also means to sustainability objectives for operators. And we also thought that maybe, finding the right balance in terms of uncertainty around innovation was really interesting. And then, as I said, the global benchmark for framework for sustainability outcomes was really big as well, which would then allow to perhaps, in addition to performance management, some of these cities or operators also, enable to set incentives for achieving certain outcomes. Of course, that then poses the question as to whether you look at a particular operator or a particular city, or whether it's whether it's a global solution. And so that created really interesting discussions. How to develop a framework around modularization was also something that we found really interesting, and something that is really definitely promising in terms of future research, and also a platform. And here I mean not a platform at a station, but an IT platform for information exchange between the different users in this context was also seen as something that is worth exploring. This is the next point is something that is leading on perfectly from the discussion that we had after the previous presentation, because we also felt, how can we, get from intention to action? And that's not just around planning guidelines, but how can we change consumer behavior in particular? And I think that is a field that is really promising going forward still. And also, of course, how technology sort of influences that behavior is, of course, very topical too. And then finally, because we talked quite a bit about revenue management as well, particularly in the Nordic countries in Europe, where they have a lot of innovation and a lot of really fancy ideas around ticketing and how to make that more flexible. But then how to evaluate those approaches and perhaps revise in future rounds is something that has not been explored so much, and we found that this is definitely worth researching a bit more. In terms of policy recommendations, again, we were all about drawing things and visualization, and I do realize now that this is not the best photo of that poster. So we developed a massive poster there where we had zero emission buses, we had even some helicopters, drones, and we had COVID in here, and the environment, and how technology impacts all of that, and essentially helps us or helps consumers to adapt to this new environment and to drive more sustainable outcomes together with operators and with transport authorities. So we thought also, as a result of our discussion, that it was really important to recommend that if there is a push to, say, provide free public transport, then what also needs to happen at the same time is that the authorities and the operators, possibly jointly, need to ensure that there is sufficient public transport capacity available. Because if there are only 3 buses or something in the system, and you have suddenly 1 million users wanting to use those 3 buses, then the outcome will be, a huge crowd of disappointed users that you will then find difficult to convince to, get out of the car again in future rounds of transport activity. So we found that a really important point, that there needs to be sufficient capacity before any sort of incentives or policies or regulations on public transport use are put in place, which means there needs to be sufficient funding for this, right? So this, buses, trains, trams, and even small aircraft, they cost a lot of money. And so that money needs to come from somewhere. And so that creates also a lot of uncertainty, not just on the consumer side of things, but also on a transport operator and authority side of things, right? How they implement then perhaps their sustainability targets. Where's the money going to come from? We, New South Wales just got a budget today, and I don't think that there's too much in terms of transport in there, which worries me a little, and comes back to this point. You can have the best intentions, but then when it's time to put money on the table, quite often this is where politicians or government organizations fail to do that. And I think perhaps there's a need therefore to have a bit more of a balanced view around what the vision is in terms of achieving targets, what are realistic targets, and where the money is going to come from. And that can be from both government and the private sector. But I think the discussion on this needs to be a bit more realistic and perhaps a bit more balanced as well. That's one of the things that we were recommending. And then there's also a much greater need for sharing data and information and best practice around all this, to understand that this is not a local but a global issue. So you can learn from another, from case studies and so on. So there's a lot of scope for improving there. Encouraging more flexibility in contracts was there. Digital co-production among stakeholders, particularly in the decision making, was there, particularly as a result of that, that exercise that I mentioned, where we had the operators and the authorities sitting at the same table, and we were able to observe how they would negotiate in this environment, which was fascinating. And so that allowed us to say, look, maybe there's an opportunity for co-production there, which would be really quite fantastic and very useful for achieving some of those sustainability targets. And then we also talked about inclusiveness, so it's not just inclusiveness in terms of transport modes and transport offerings. It's also inclusiveness in regards to distribution of tickets in terms of information. So not everyone has an app. Some people don't even have a smartphone and these sort of things. So we thought that this needs to be sort of perhaps more acknowledged as well when forming policy. And finally, obviously the system-wide approach to more sort of innovative fares and ticketing was there. But finally, the big thing that we thought would be very useful to recommend is to really think big in terms of what to do in terms of policy. Because when we look at sustainability in particular, we are trying to change a lot of things that we do with a focus on 2030 or 2040. And so it's not, obviously it's useful to have incremental sort of improvements, but we also wanted to encourage policymakers to think a lot more outside the box, to think more strategic, think big. And that, just to give one example, would be around 3D mobility. Why not use the vertical space as well, which is something that is definitely coming. And so that is one of the things that will be discussed in workshop 4 at the next Thredbo conference in Cape Town. And so in addition to this text here, I put a fantastic photo up there, and I can't wait to travel there and visit this fantastic location and have a wonderful glass of wine with all of you, and again have some fantastic discussions around the use of technological innovation for achieving sustainable public transport outcomes. So we will continue on this theme because we felt that there's so much else to discuss, and that this is definitely an issue that's getting more topical rather than less, unfortunately. With that, I would like to invite John to contribute to this and to add anything that I may have missed. And of course, I would also like to invite the audience to submit questions through the Q&A. John, should I just stop sharing my screen?
Yeah, I think that's fine to stop sharing. And thank you, Rico. That's great timing as well. But I will take the opportunity to just add in a short number of remarks whilst webinar participants think of their questions, and also reflect on John Stanley's comment there about the great surf beaches. I don't know whether he's talking about Sydney or not. Two reflections. I mean, one, the pandemic, and I think you're absolutely right. We can't, and indeed we shouldn't neglect to continue to reflect on the impact of the pandemic. I was interested to see our colleagues in workshop 3 on several occasions used the phrase post-pandemic during their presentation. We weren't so bold. So Rico had one of the slides, I think the phrase the new normal, and that's the new normal, the current normal. Indeed, that is the phrase that we continue to use, particularly as we're still looking at various aspects of remote working. So what does the pandemic mean for sustainability? I think sadly will prove to be an enduring theme. The Sydney context is not dissimilar to others, where we're somewhere between 75 to 80% of building back patronage post, if I use that phrase, pandemic, and that may be as good as it gets, and therefore you're in the business of looking for new markets whilst also doing that within to quote the phrase of our workshop, whilst achieving sustainable public transport outcomes. And that links with the sort of second comment I wanted to emphasize, which also came out of Rico's presentation. Yeah, there is a danger, isn't there, that one can be over reliant on apps and indeed technology per se. And I think there's a lovely segue there back into some of the workshop 3 issues, because an app-led approach is by definition one that is, for many people, not going to contribute to enhance social inclusion outcomes for them. And we do a lot of work as well in a regional context where that remains a pressing issue. Okay, that has given an opportunity for a first question to come in, and this is from John Preston. And John writes, the innovation you seem to focus on was zero emission buses, but what about autonomous and shared services? Could they be game changers? Maybe you start, Rico. And
yeah, first of all, I would like to agree with you that there were 2 excellent points that you added there, and particularly with COVID, reading the newspapers today, reading that the finance minister and the defense minister of Germany now have tested positive for COVID, tells me, somehow maybe it may not be that, the mortality rates may not be so high, or maybe it's not so much in the media, but it's definitely not post-COVID yet. So it's still with us and will be with us possibly for a while. And so that, I think, was an excellent remark. In terms of our focus, that was indeed very much on zero emissions, and even more on buses. So I do agree. So there was quite a focus on that. Having said that, we also talked about trains and also on individual car travel, because my interest lies in drones and that sort of stuff. We talked about that too, to some extent. And there was some conversation around shared services. And so we talked about this too, and how to encourage more shared services. And John probably can talk more about, on-demand transport as well, which was discussed too, which possibly falls into that category as well. And that definitely has the potential to contribute to emission reduction. Anything that is shared, I think, is good. But then you also need to consider that some of those shared services should not take away the potential of mass transit. And this is where perhaps the helicopters and that sort of stuff comes in, where some people would argue, look, this has the potential to, be mass transit, and you don't need trains or bus truck rapid transit systems and bus trunk routes anymore. I think that is a false assumption. And so we discussed this quite intensely also as part of the workshop, where, the smallish sort of, even micro sort of shared schemes, they're good for sort of feeding sort of the first and the last mile, but you will still need those, heavy sort of transport sort of operators, i.e. bus and train operators. And autonomous vehicles, obviously, I don't think that we discussed it too much. We discussed it from a perspective of safety, I think, but we didn't go into too much detail there, to be honest, because we really focused on, more on the emission side of things. Is that right, John? Did I?
Yeah. I think that is right, Rico. I mean, another thing that's probably worth mentioning. Yes, there was quite a focus on buses, but that was partly in, I guess, almost in the spirit of Thredbo, in the sense of we found, unbeknown to us in advance, that we had an incredible amount of expertise in the workshop in the ZEB context, particularly from Singapore, and therefore participants were very keen to learn more about it. But that's sort of trichotomy that you put up there, John. The electrification, sharing, and autonomy is, of course, synonymous with the now famous 3 Rs, as in 3 revolutions in urban transportation, from colleagues at UC Irvine, which I think makes it's a very nice framework to use when thinking on the future of public transport, which in itself could be a separate workshop topic. But given that we certainly said of those sort of 3 Rs, if you like, the least covered would have been autonomous vehicles, that might be one to mark into the discussions for Thredbo 18, Rico.
Absolutely, but Kimmo makes a good point here in the chat, which is that the autonomous service that we see at the moment aren't actually autonomous yet. So the technology is not quite ready yet. There are a lot of trials happening, but there's still at least on the roads. Obviously, there are automated trains, and so there's a lot of that happening, and in all sorts of jurisdictions, and metros in particular. If you go to Dubai, or it's getting
Sydney
and there's a lot of discussion as to whether this makes actually sense and whether it's actually cheaper to do it that way rather than having a driver in there. And we have done some work on that, but that's a different issue. But I do agree with you, Kimmo, there that at least from an autonomous point of view, it's not quite there. Shared services, it depends on what you define. What a shared service is. To me, my local bus into the city and then the train from Wynyard into Redfern, where our university is, are perfect examples of shared services. But then obviously these are more like public transport assets, and you probably refer more to shared vehicles, private vehicles, and that sort of stuff. And I do agree that this is has room for improvement, and yet again another thing that we can discuss at the next Thredbo conference. John, the next question is probably you're here, like on-demand public transport.
Yeah, so Jacob's commenting, on-demand public transport services have also been used in in New Zealand in smaller towns where patronage cannot support fixed route high capacity public transport, and that's absolutely right. And of course there is also a connection between the point that we were making previously, because you know, our expectation, if not requirement, for much of the shared use autonomous vehicles in the future is that they should also be operated on an on-demand basis, although there'll be a case for you know, high capacity fixed route corridors as well. We've got a lot of experience also within New South Wales of on-demand transport, as they choose to call it here. It's still, unfortunately, it's generally still classified as expensive, however you do the calculations, and even often in comparison with fixed route, although less so in rural areas. But one point that I've been making for a number of years and will continue to do so is that when one evaluates the impact, and there's that question about translation of findings from Thredbo into planning and evaluation guidelines, when one evaluates the impact of ODT as other Thredbo contributions have in the past, one really needs to be looking at the wider impact in terms of enhancements to quality of life, encouraging people to live independently and so on. And I think there's more work to be done there. John Preston is proposing a fourth revolution. I might steal this because I do have to give a conference talk tomorrow on something completely different, but it relates to potentially to the fourth revolution. Is connectivity the fourth and perhaps the most important revolution? Do you want to comment, Rico? I'm sure you can get a aviation dimension into your answer as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. No, and it's not just aviation. It's as what I said before. It's the first and last mile, right? Actually, sort of trunk networks to the mass transport systems that cities, at least the large cities that I know, will continue to rely on. And so, you know, it's the question: how do you get that person from and to that larger bus terminal or the larger train station, and what does that do to the door-to-door travel time, and you know, and convenience and all that. And that has to, you know, obviously I'm interested in this from a long haul sort of perspective, or sort of long distance travel, and how to connect that with city travel. But it equally, you know, applies to within city travel. I've just recently been in Japan, and I found it incredible that I had to get you know, all these different train tickets for all the different metros. So I tried to do the right thing and use, you know, the metros and the buses, and you know, here in Sydney we are used to the Opal card, and in other cities you have one ticket, you know, you use the entire public transport system. And over there, you know, because there are so many private operators in, you know, in the metro system, you have to buy a new ticket for each and every operator, which I found really you know, quite a hindrance, and didn't really make it very attractive in terms of using public transport. And so, you know, sometimes these little things which inform you that, you know, maybe, you know, seamlessness and connectivity are really the drivers that will, you know, enhance public transport patronage.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm sure, though we may not have said it overtly in the workshop report, that we can actually see these connectivity issues, and particularly first and last mile, as actually underlying quite a lot of what we talked about.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I think perhaps this is a suitable moment to draw a line under presentation number 2. So thank you very much, Rico, for leading on the presentation and fielding the questions as well.
Thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing you all in Cape Town.
Okay, we're we're just a couple of minutes ahead of time, but that's okay. That's within an acceptable tolerance. So let us now move on to our third presentation slot, which is from workshop 5. Our presenter is Dr. Joran Smith, who directs the Mobility in Transformation unit and manages the overall mobility service strategy at RISE Research Institutes of Sweden. In addition to his other duties, Joran holds an honorary senior research associate position at ITLS, and we've enjoyed having him as a regular visitor here. Joran's personal research agenda revolves around understanding how local, regional, and national governments can firstly govern the decline of urban automobility, and secondly, pave the way for emerging mobility services that contribute to sustainable and just transport systems. Now, although Joran is giving the presentation, he will be ably assisted, particularly when it comes to Q&A, by Chin Ho, who's also with us in the webinar. And Chin is a senior lecturer in GIS and spatial logistics with expertise in spatial analytics and demand modeling using big data. Chin has an immense interest in intelligent mobility and has played a leading role in a number of prominent studies, including the Sydney MAS trial, which was investigating the use of digital technologies for improving customer experience and greening transport and the logistics sector. At that point, I will hand over to Joran for his presentation and invite him to share his screen.
Thank you, John. And I will see if I'm able to share my screen. John, can you please confirm that you can hear me all right? That you can see my presentation?
We can see your first page there. Thanks.
Perfect. All right. Thank you for that introduction, John. And thank you everyone who have tuned in and to listen today. I will just try to reconfigure my desktop so I can see the presentation myself. All right, that should do it. Yes, my name is Goran or Göran, and last year I had the privilege to chair a workshop at the amazing Thredbo conference together with Chin, as John said, and it was workshop 5, and it was called Governing Emerging Mobility Services. So this presentation will neatly continue on some of the open questions that appeared after Rico's presentation. The background to this workshop, the first bit is shared with all the workshops at Thredbo. We are in the midst of a sustainability crisis, and land-based mobility and passenger mobility, those systems are major contributors to greenhouse gas emissions, local pollutions, inequalities, land use problems, all of those things that you already know about. And one of the best ways of amending at least some of these negative externalities is to increase the amount of shared traveling. And the most efficient way, as Rico mentioned, to travel together is by public transport. But at the same time, public transport is also in crisis, especially since the pandemic hurt the ridership and the economic models of many public transport systems around the globe. But in parallel to this, we have seen an influx of new service models that have changed the urban landscape of the streets, at least in many metropolitan cities. And they've also stirred up a lot of emotions and caused a debate on whether they complement public transport? Do they offer new opportunities to travel? And do they replace car trips? Or do they compete with public transport? Do they clutter the streets? And do they primarily substitute walking and biking? The results are mixed, the emotions are high, and we wanted to dig into this question and primarily to better understand what governments can do to make sure that it's the positive scenario rather than the negative one. So we want to gather new lessons regarding the governance and market conditions under which innovations make public transport and mobility services more attractive to users, as well as more sustainable and effective. And this workshop continued the discussion from 2 previous workshops at the 2 previous Thredbo conferences in Stockholm and Singapore. And if you want to read those reports, that they are available online. Those are links, and as John said, you will have the presentation after the webinar. But in Sydney last year, we had 13 papers from discussing different types of mobility services and in cases across 4 different continents. Let's see if I remember. I've actually written it down. We had papers about demand responsive transit, about ride sourcing, ride sharing, and mobility as a service. We did also have papers about innovations within traditional public transport, within taxi systems, and within paratransit. So a lot of different types of mobility services and a lot of different contexts. We started with presenting and discussing these. Then we went into what we call the World Cafe conversation, where I think we had 4 or 5 different tables addressing these different types of mobility services. And then we had 4 rounds of different questions where people moved around the different tables and to discuss, for instance, who have been involved in ride sourcing, what are the objectives of demand responsive transit, and what policies have been implemented in relation to mobility as a service, and what have the outcomes been. And we made sure that everyone, I think we had 19 or 20 participants, were involved in all the different discussions at some point. Then we met up in plenum and produced a set of recommendations for policymaking and research. And those are the ones that I will present to you in a minute and that we will discuss, I'm sure. But firstly, a few contributions from the workshop and the papers. Many of them were really good and are already published either in Research in Transportation Economics, sorry, I forgot the exact title, or in other outlets. In terms of who has been involved or not, we found that in many of the cases presented and discussed at the workshop, the developments had, especially in the initial stages, primarily been driven by industry actors, policymakers, and academia, but with very limited user demand or user interest. And mobility as a service is the most obvious example in this regard, where we had examples from developments in Finland and Sweden and Australia, and in all of them, there was a lot of hype and a lot of interest from us within the transport sector, but quite few mass users in reality. Users and also workers, meaning the drivers and the staffers, they were mostly I'm not sure if this is a good term, but let's call them that anyway, reactive agents. So they mostly reacted to the changing circumstances. And we had some examples with the protest that taxi drivers have had against the ride sourcing. And we also have beautiful examples of when demand responsive transit was introduced and users started using them and travel differently, basically. In terms of the effects, we have a lot of mixed results. Similar services have produced different results in different contexts, and ride sourcing is, of course, one of them. And overall, the sustainability benefits are mostly unproven still. Despite that, some incumbents, some workers, and some users have experienced significant effects, and one that was discussed quite a bit was the drop of the value of taxi medallions in New South Wales and in the US, for example. And across all the different cases, the policymakers wanted these new services to complement public transport. Of course, I don't think we had any cases. There are those cases, but we did not have any cases in the workshop where the ambition was to replace public transport to a great extent. In terms of what policies that have been put in place, we had a lot of cases of proactive preparation for what was seen as inevitable changes to the transport system, and that was mostly digitalization and optimization. So basically, a lot of governments stepped in and said and wanted to create the rules of the game before the game started, and we saw that with mobility as a service in Finland, and we saw that with robot taxis in China. We had those examples in the workshop. But we had a lot of what could be seen more as a reactive policy responses too, in relation to also robot taxis, but also ride sourcing and informal transport. And here we saw quite different policy responses across different contexts. And for instance, you can see that with micromobility, which has been enabled in some cities and banned in other ones. But we also saw that the policy responses, they evolve over time. And again, that's the case with micromobility, but also with ride sourcing, that in some cities with those services have been banned at the start, they are now legalized and governance frameworks have been introduced. Well, let's talk about recommendations, and all of these will, of course, be on on a high level, on a generic level. So if you have any questions about them, please firstly post questions in the Q&A so we can discuss it. Chen has promised to answer all the difficult ones, but please also reach out and most importantly read the papers. You can find them online, and many of them are very informative. But let's talk about governance, because we had three recommendations that concern governance frameworks. And the first one was that we saw a need for regulatory frameworks that pinpoint sustainability objectives, including KPIs, but also the roles for shared mobility services, because the workshop participants saw a lacking in current regulatory frameworks, where they did not really describe what role the new types of shared mobility services was supposed to play and why. Then we talked about systemic, multimodal, and context-aware governance approaches, which of course would be great. But what we mean by this is that systemic in the way that they both demote undesirable behavior and promote desirable ones, not just one or the other. but also systemic in that they look at the wider effects, not not only within the transport system. Then multimodal, because there was a lot of talk in the workshop about the shortcomings of unimodal governance approaches. And then, of course, context where we had cases of Chinese cities, we had South African cities, we had rural context in Switzerland and in Sweden. Shared mobility services will play a very different roles across these contexts, and of course, then governance approaches should also be different. Lastly, on that note, we had many of the taxi and bus operators that were especially the bus operators or the public transport operators that were present at the workshop were frustrated about rules and contracts that did not allow them to be flexible and adjust their services during the contract period, but also to optimize the use of resources and make use of spare capacities. We had 2 points of collaboration. The first one was to introduce public-private people collaboration throughout the entire policy cycle. So both when drafting policies, when implementing policies, and when evaluating and adjusting them. And here we talked also about I'm not sure exactly what phrase you used, Lisa, but I think you said silent groups, but we talked about non-users, less resourceful stakeholders, and what could be termed as anticipated policy losers. We want them to be involved and represented and taken care of, and there are 2 reasons for that. One of them is democratic, but the other one is also to make the policy implementation easier. And we had the case that was discussed from Finland. I see that we are represented from there in the webinar, but when they had the big, what was called, I think, the transport code and the reform of transport regulations to allow for the introduction of MOST, one could argue that they did not really think about the capabilities of public transport authorities and taxi companies when drafting that. For research, we, of course, as Rico also wanted to go to beautiful Cape Town, so we proposed a new workshop to continue the discussion. We had a lot of fun, and I'm sure that we will have a lot of fun in Cape Town too. The proposed workshop, we call it Shared Mobility Services, Roles, Effects, and Governance Models in Different Geographies. So there are two slight changes to this one compared to the workshop that we had. The first one is that we put a bigger emphasis on the word shared, because as was mentioned in the Q&A on Rico's presentation, we do not really know, we haven't cracked how to make people want to share rights and actually do it. We want to understand what governments can do to make sure that that happens. The other one, which I have talked or mentioned a few different times, is how to adapt the roles and the governance approaches across different geographies. More generally, I will just end this presentation by mentioning a few things that we see are interesting avenues for further research. In terms of roles, we need to better understand the conditions for scalability and added social value from all these different types of mobility services. We need to understand how one can integrate both informal mobility services, but also non-transport services, because we believe that that's important to get the systemic effects and the value for potential uses that could be achieved. Then we also need to understand the transferability of these models to cash-based markets. Cash is still king in many places around the world, and to offline, or to those who do not have smartphones or want to have smartphones or are able to have smartphones. In terms of governance models, we see a need for democratic and transformative partnership model. So basically how one can make these changes in a democratic way, but while still keeping the transformative part, in that we basically including incumbents, but not making sure that we do not stick to only incremental change, because the workshop saw a risk of that, basically. Finally, in terms of effects, we saw a need for more studies on revealed preferences and wider systems effect. And here we, especially in when it comes to mobility as a service, we see a lot of pilots, a lot of operations, and a lot of R&D money, public R&D money invested, but still surprisingly few are evaluated and in a systemic and transparent way. So please be better at doing that. And in this, we also need to look at the changes and perspectives of workers within the systems, and with those non-users, those that are not interested in and will not use, for instance, demand responsive transit systems. Here we had, those are neither worker or non-users, but they are or non-users in the sense that we had a beautiful study that looked at why women do not use ride sourcing services in South Africa, which I really recommend you to take a look at. With that said, I thank you for your attention. Please take a look at all these beautiful workshop attendees. I want to thank them as well, of course, for all their insights, and mostly to Chin, who was a perfect companion in organizing and running this workshop. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Göran, and thank you also for keeping to time, which means that we have the advertised amount of time available for Q&A. Waiting for some questions to appear. I'm sure they will shortly. Just whilst people are thinking, let me put to you the question you know that I'm going to ask you, because this is John Stanley's pertinent question from earlier on. How can we get findings from Thredbo included in planning and evaluation guidelines?
You want to respond to that, Chin, or should I take it?
Or you both can.
Yep. Go ahead, Göran.
All right, then I will start. And I don't think I have much new insights to add, but because I do, as previous speakers, I do believe that it is happening. First of all, I do also believe that the planning and evaluation guidelines, that's not everything. I think what we need is, we want to have an impact on policy making, and I think we are having that. And I think that the participation and dialogue at the Thredbo events, because let's call this a Thredbo event too, that's the most important part. But apart from that, I think, at least within our field, within mobility services, we need to produce evidence on effects from the real world applications. I think that's really important, and I think it's important to package and communicate that in a way that policymakers can understand and appreciate. And apart from that, I also think we need to focus more on the policy making and policy implementation, and in comparison to only policy content, because I think that, at least what I've seen in the developments of mobility as a service policies, it's a lot easier to discuss what should be included in those policies, and then how they should be implemented and accepted and enforced. So I think we need to, at least in this space, focus more on that too. You want to add anything, Chin?
Sure. I think it's really difficult for the emerging transport technology, John. I'm going to be very honest with you. When it comes to mobility as a service, all we know is basically quite a small-scale assessment of various trial and commercial offer. So I would say it's very early day on to basically sell the story to the government and include them into the guideline. So at this stage, I guess, maintaining the open dialogue, updating the decision maker on the progress that we made in the Thredbo going to be a good move. And if it turns out to be, the question relating to the scalability and all of those wider impact prove to be the case, then I hope, the governance going to follow and the government going to incorporate those findings into the official guideline. But those questions of including them in the guideline as of now is unthinkable, I would say.
Yep, I would agree with you. I think certainly one of the things we do need to advocate for, though, is evidence-based decision making, so that that people don't get too caught up in hype, which was one of the phrases that Joran used to describe a lot of what has happened in the mouse space. We have a question. So John Preston asks, to what extent is the market power of the likes of Google a barrier to emerging mobility services, and how can such organizations be regulated? Which of you is going to go for that one first?
I can start. I think that's an excellent question. My experience from talking to both, let's call them innovators and policymakers, is that it's not maybe the market power that Google in this case have used, but the eventuality of them using it is discussed a lot and influences how both innovators and policymakers act. I know that one policymaker that discussed it a lot in the strategy is the Public Transport Authority in the Oslo region in Norway, Ruter, where they see a big risk of what they call losing the interaction with customers, because if their users only use Google Maps and not their app, and then they cannot communicate with them and they cannot nudge them and influence the traveling choices. So I think that is the dominance of Google Maps and those global services. Of course, that makes it more difficult for newcomers to get a big share of the market, and there's always the risk that if you introduce something new, Google Maps will do something, or Google in this case will do something similar, and then they can outprice you quite easily. But I'm not sure what I was going at. Yeah, I think that it hasn't really happened that much yet, and I think that in many cases, as Rico mentioned, when he went to Japan, transport is still, and the digital space of transport is still very local and very different across different contexts. So depending on what uses you are looking at, there is still opportunities for smaller actors to outperform the big global ones when it comes to local problems. I'm not sure if that was a good answer, so please say something more intelligent and informative, Chin.
I'm not sure my answer is going to be any more intelligent, but I'm going to add my 2 cents anyway. I think it's an excellent question, John. And I think I do want to recognize the difference between vertical integration versus horizontal integration here. The market power of Google and Apple and all of those giant Intel is basically have the power to perform vertical integration, if you like, by purchasing or using the financial lever they got to acquire whatever business service they would like to include. And we see them quite a bit in Uber, for example, acquiring car next door and become, the peer-to-peer car sharing here in Sydney. And the same goes for eBay and so on and so forth. My 2 cents is that I don't think that would be a barrier to emerging mobility. If we are thinking about the user as the end benefit of the emerging or new mobility service, so long as someone, regardless of who it is, that improve the service for the end user, I would welcome those. But the other side of regulation is really important, because the role of mobility as a service is not only in terms of improving the value for the user, but also achieving some societal benefit. And if there is no regulation, big guys like Google and Uber are gonna be running after profitability, and that's when the issue of purchasing profitability gonna be trading against sustainability in the long term. And hence, if the government do not put in some regulation or play more active role, that's going to be entirely in the hands of the private company. And that may not necessarily what the society as a whole really want for mobility as a service or any form of intelligent mobility in the future.
Thank you, Chin. I'm going to wrap up proceedings just in a moment or two, but Joran, would you like to have a final word on your workshop theme?
No, I'm happy. I've talked a lot, and I would just again and to complement what you will say soon, and what Becky has already posted in the chat function, is that please come to next Thredbo. We will have a great discussion, I'm sure, and I really personally I'm really interested in all the evidence or lack thereof of how governments can make sure that mobility services are actually shared. I think that's really interesting, and also to have a look at how these mobility services are used and what effects they have in context that we do not discuss oftenly. I think that was a real treat of this this workshop, that we had cases of rural Switzerland, of cities in South Africa, and many more contexts. So please come, and please share your studies.
Great, thank you very much. Well, it only remains for me to complete the very pleasurable task of thanking our presenters, Lisa, Wean, Rico, Joran and Chin, for their contributions to Thredbo 17 and to this webinar. And I think it's greatly appreciated the way in which the various contributors have been able to make cross references to the other workshops which were being discussed this evening, because that makes the point that we also, we don't want our workshops to operate in silos, and we're very interested in the cross-fertilization. This is the second of 3 webinars reporting on the outcomes of Thredbo 17. Our third webinar is next Tuesday, which is the 28th of September. And details have already been posted about those. Recordings will be available from all of the webinars on the Thredbo website in due course. As you've heard already many times this evening, I'll say it for the last time, Thredbo 19 will be held in Cape Town from the 29th of September to the 3rd of October.
18, John, you're getting ahead of yourself.
Oh, sorry, okay. Well, I'll say what I was going to say, which is go to the web link, which is in the chat, and you'll find everything you need to know there, including how to submit your abstract. That concludes the webinar for today. Thank you again, presenters and attendees.